Our topic today, sexual violation in Buddhism, is one that must be treated not only as an intellectual matter, but as an ethical, political, and embodied one. We acknowledge the reality and pervasiveness of sexual abuse. According to RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse and Incest Network, the largest anti-sexual violence network in the US, an American is sexually assaulted every 73 seconds. 1 in 6 women have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. 1 in 33 men have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. And 1 in 2 transgender individuals have been sexually assaulted or abused.
Given these statistics, we recognize the likelihood that our audience today may include survivors of sexual assault. We wanted to signal that some of the material presented today might be distressing. We encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself, and we include the National Sexual Assault Online Hotline on our handout under resources. If you didn't get a handout, you can grab one. They're right at the top of the room by the door. We're also available if you'd like to check in after the event is over, and our emails are also on the handout. We want to thank survivors of sexual violence in Buddhist communities and beyond, whose feedback has been invaluable to us as we continue to work on this research. We're speaking today from the traditional territories of the Adena Hopewell, Potawatomi, Lenape, Shawanwa, and other peoples. We want to acknowledge that there's an epidemic of sexual violence against Indigenous women. More than 1 in 2 Native women have experienced sexual violence. Native Americans are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to all races. 97% of sexual abuse against Native American women are perpetrated by a non-Native person. Finally, we want to acknowledge that our research is sponsored by the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project, which is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. And you can find details of this larger project also on the resource list.
Great. So Dr. Langenberg and I wrote the paper together, but when we deliver the paper, we always kind of, we try and share the kind of labor of speaking the paper. So today I'll start and I'll read half of the paper, and then Dr. Langenberg will read the second half, but the paper was a complete paper by both of us. Okay, so let's see. So in March 2018, Buddhist Project Sunshine, an innocuously titled GoFundMe page, illustrated with a bright orange sunshine over a green, fertile valley, began circulating on the internet. The accompanying description of the project, however, was far from innocent. It declared that Buddhist Project Sunshine, BPS for short, had been launched to bring light and healing to widespread intergenerational sexualized violence at the core of the Shambhala Buddhist community. Andrea Wynne, its founder, revealed she and others had been victims of sexual abuse in Shambhala and had been shamed and silenced after reporting it. Wynne published 3 consecutive reports on the internet. Each contained impact statements by survivors detailing their sexual abuse by Shambhala teachers and a therapeutic reading method to digest the difficult material. Wynne shared that the inspiration for the project had come from Yeshe Tsogyal, a famous 8th century female Buddhist teacher, and Wynne framed the project as the recovery of Dakini wisdom, the divine feminine in Tibetan Buddhism. Combining Buddhist, psychotherapeutic, and feminist narratives, BPS functioned therefore not only to expose sexual violence in Shambhala, but to envision a new post-patriarchal Buddhism, one marked by transparency, community empowerment, and recognition of the human limitations of the teacher. Now, one of the most disturbing revelations of BPS was the intergenerational pattern of abuse it pointed to. Shambhala's founder, Chogyam Trungpa, was openly promiscuous, and he died of an alcohol related disease at the age of 48. His American Dharma heir, Ozal Tenzin, knowingly had unprotected sex with several of his students while HIV positive. One student and his girlfriend later died of AIDS, as did Ozal Tenzin. Trungpa's son, Sakyong Mipam, was forced to step down from his leadership position after the second BPS report detailed his abuse. So the trajectory of Shambhala illustrates a reoccurring pattern of sexual and other related abuses occurring in Western convert Buddhist communities that has been reported since the 1980s. These communities began in the 1960s and 70s, and historically they've been populated by white, upper middle class participants. So cutting across Buddhist lineages, offenders have included many prominent first and second generation Asian and American teachers. As one senior scholar of American Buddhism phrased in us to an email exchange, quote, "If you were studying with one of the leading American Buddhist figures in the 1970s and 80s, the odds were heavy that you were working with a predator," end quote. So our intention is not to be provocative here. We're merely wanting to name the extent and the weight of the problem. Here, however, we must forestall any move towards blaming these dynamics on the so-called Asian patriarchy. Given the prevalence of Orientalist depictions of the Asian guru as a sexual threat, we must be particularly careful not to reproduce essentialized racial stereotypes. And one way we attempt to disrupt this is by showing how abuse has occurred across North American Buddhist communities, including those such as Against the Stream Buddhist leader Noah Levine, a Gen X community, a white Gen X community, which explicitly positioned itself as a progressive alternative to sexist traditional Asian Buddhism. Now, while there have been a handful of popular books written by journalists and a few autobiographical reflections by Buddhist practitioners, or none of which, however, are survivors, relatively little academic work has been done on these cases. So Dr. Langenberg and I hope to fill this lacuna in our current collaborative book project. One of our main focuses is on how Buddhists are responding to these abuses and the impact their response has on survivors of abuse. And thus far in our research, we have identified 5 main responses. So the first response, and these are our terms, is the apologetic defense, in which abuse is denied, the teachers are defended through canonical doctrine, and victims are dismissed as misunderstanding their actions. A second response is the bad apple defense, in which individual teachers are denounced, but the wider community and tradition itself is spared critique. The third is the Buddhist response. This recognizes systemic issues, but calls for Buddhist solutions, such as a renewed focus on Buddhist ethics. A fourth response, is the generative response, which also recognizes systemic issues, but turns to non-Buddhist discourses, for example, psychotherapy, to revision Buddhism. And finally, reductive critique, in which both individual Buddhists and institutional Buddhism are critiqued without any concern for reform or reconstruction. So in our presentation today, we're going to focus on responses that fall in and across the categories of Buddhist response and generative response. And in the face of denial from teachers, that would mark apologetic defense, and the absence of real institutional accountability, that marks a bad apple defense, we want to show how efforts to respond to sexual abuse have fallen largely to individual or collective grassroots efforts, usually led by survivors themselves. So how do we do this? What's our methodology? So before turning to these efforts, a few words are necessary on methodology and terminology. So our general methodological orientation towards the project is inspired by the post-colonial feminist lineage of anthropology that advances ethnography as an act of identification, witnessing, and care. And an early expression of this is Ruth Behar's 1996 articulation of a native anthropology in which scholars claim a personal connection to their ethnographic sites and view identity and relationship rather than difference and a separation as key to research. More recently, in her work with sexual abuse survivors, Emma Louise Bach in 2017 has called for an ethnography of care to be enacted towards one's ethnographic interlocutors and also towards oneself, the ethnographers in our case. Now, some of their publications are pictured here on this slide. Now, ethnographic care demands attention to forms of suffering that are experienced by ethnographic subjects, and openness that is a form of emotional as well as intellectual labor. For us, for Amy and I, embarking on this book project as a collaboration in which analytic and affective labors are shared is one expression of such care. Working directly with survivors and advocates to share resources and develop approaches for Buddhist communities is another. A key component also of our ethnography of care is a survivor-centered orientation. This means that we focus our attention on survivor perspectives, resisting a pattern of fetishization of the abuser's actions or focusing on community structures to the exclusion of survivor perspectives. In every Buddhist community we have studied, we have found a tilt in the direction of power embodied in the figure of the teacher and the organizational structures of the community, and a move away from the experience of survivors. So, of course, this tilt is not particular to Buddhist contexts. For instance, feminist philosopher Kate Mann, pictured here, along with her most recent book, has brilliantly theorized how the entitlements of patriarchy work in tandem with other oppressive systems, such as racism, to produce unjust outcomes in many environments. We're also aware that there is not one survivor experience. In many cases, there are not just differences, but actually conflict between survivors. And we've come to see three broad categories. One category is those survivors who stay and they want to be part of community reform. A second is those who leave their community in which they've suffered abuse, but they continue to practice Buddhism in another community or sometimes even started their own community. And third, survivors who leave the community and the tradition, and they feel that community reform is actually part of the problem in that it often involves attempts, has frequently involved attempts to pressurize survivors and make them conform for community harmony. So survivors in this third category experience the pressure to be part of community reform as a further form of violence and dishonesty. They report that Buddhist communities have weaponized doctrines in support of community cohesion rather than survivor justice. Okay, just as there are multiple survivor experiences, one must also be attuned to the impact that other types of difference, race, ethnicity, class, ability, age, gender identity have on the experience of survivors. In the recent book, The Right to Sex, Amir Srinivasan echoes Black feminists in noting that it is crucial that feminists employ an intersectional lens that considers race, class, and caste, as well as gender inequities in the allegations and cases of sexual abuse. Buddhist survivors that have come forward in our research have been overwhelmingly white, female, cisgender survivors. Now, given the historic demographics of Western convert communities, this is unsurprising. We must be careful, however, not to erase the abuse suffered by women of color, cisgender men, trans or non-binary people in Buddhist communities. For example, in the case of Triratna, a community started in the 1960s by Dennis Lingwood, a British man known by his Buddhist name Sangrashita. The survivors are male. Young heterosexual men were coerced into having sex with Lingwood and other gay men in the order. More recently, allegations against the Karmapa have come from 3 Asian women. So future research might and should consider whether there are demographic differences in how survivors are treated and how racism, homophobia, and transphobia in convert sanghas might have impeded survivors from coming forward. It might also consider how and why historically vulnerable or marginalized communities may choose to prioritize group unity over more transparency around abuse. So terminology, how do we name this? Terminology is a huge issue in our project. So the complexity we are describing contributes to confusion and conflict among Buddhists about the correct naming of sexual abuse experiences. So Willa Blythe Baker opens her Lion's Roar account of her own sexual relationship with her supposedly celibate Tibetan teacher with a series of signifiers: victim, survivor, consort, partner, one of those women, noting that none of these labels fit quite right, yet all capture dimensions of her experience at different times. So the complexities of naming have been compounded by a grouping together of a range of offences and offenders. How then can one language appropriately to distinguish between various actors and various actions in various contexts? There's a lot of diversity essentially, but while still acknowledging the shared patterns and cultures of secrecy, complicity, and gendered hierarchies that have enabled them. So here we agree with feminist philosopher Linda Alcoff, pictured here with her book, that we need to come to a more complete understanding of what counts as sexual violence and move away from simplistic binary categories such as consensual sex versus rape. So in her book, Rape and Resistance, Alcoff offers the term sexual violation, noting that it captures a, quote, broad set of events beyond those involving explicit forms of violence. And it acknowledges structural constraints on consent. So as Alcoff explains, to violate means to infringe upon someone, to transgress, and can also mean to rupture or to break. Violations can happen with stealth, with manipulation, to anyone who is significantly vulnerable to the office of others. So Alcoff's definition fits well with Buddhist survivor perspectives. And we've found that the question of which terms to use is one of much concern to Sangha members wishing for both accountability towards survivors and the preservation of practice communities and the student-teacher relationship. Some of our interlocutors, those that support survivors and those that do not, have asked us to use language that discriminates clearly between different types of abuse so as not to conflate incidents of egregious abuse with more complex misuses of power. Other interlocutors have used norms that govern the work of clergy and therapists in order to classify boundary violations as abusive. In 13 states in America, it's illegal to have a relationship between, say, a therapist and a client. It's believed that the client cannot give consent, even if they do verbally give consent, because of the power hierarchy. So from the perspective of survivors, it is vital that the words used to describe and characterize their experiences do not minimize the harm that they've experienced. So flattening differences might be preferable to minimizing harm for many survivors. This is the kind of tension we're dealing with. Emma Louise Bach, whose ethnography describes her work on an anonymous rape crisis hotline, references the perfect victim narratives that circulate, causing survivors to, quote, routinely question the legitimacy of their own responses to violence, end quote. So a number of survivors that have spoken to us were confused by minimizing or misleading rhetoric used by their teachers or within their communities. For them, coming to understand these experiences of violation as harmful and unjust has sometimes been a years-long process. Okay, so grassroots efforts. So how have communities responded? So Buddhist Project Sunshine is one of a number of grassroots initiatives spanning over several decades as Buddhist practitioners have grappled with the harm of sexual violence. Now, these efforts have included awareness raising in Buddhist media and the internet, survivor-centered advocacy, peer ally action, community culture changes, and developing training or employing organizations to prevent or respond to sexual violation. All of these efforts are important, and there's actually considerable overlap between them, and many key figures are active across these areas. We've identified some of them for you on the handout. As we can't go into each of them today, obviously for time reasons. So today, for our talk, for the rest of our talk, we're going to focus on survivor-centered advocacy. So Amy will take over here. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay. I see you and I support you. Although the Buddhist press and social media has increasingly made abuse visible, many abuse survivors still experience profound loneliness and marginalization, whether they stay within their Sangha communities or leave them. It's typical for survivors to bring allegations of abuse to be told it's typical for survivors that bring allegations of abuse to be told that it is they, not the abuser, that is the problem. Often they are urged to be better Buddhists by having compassion for the teacher or working with the situation. Online support groups on Facebook and Reddit have alleviated some aspects of survivors' isolation and marginalization. In response to Sogyal Lakar's abuse, Rigpa practitioner Talia Newland began a blog called What Now? For students wishing to process their confusion about their teacher. At the same time, she started a closed Facebook group meant to support survivors. In her book, Fallout, Newland describes the work she and other moderators of the Facebook group did to prioritize survivor safety and prevent re-traumatization, especially when group members reintroduced Buddhist doctrinal concepts, such as pure perception of the guru or crazy wisdom, that had been used within Rigpa to silence victims that complained. Newland herself was not an abuse survivor, but she writes with sensitivity about the important role that the What Now private Facebook group played for those that were survivors. Sorry, 1 second. She writes, an important first step in healing was for victims to realize that they were not alone and isolated, to experience being heard and taken seriously and not shamed or made to feel guilty or inadequate as they'd been in Rigpa. We heard from many students who had left Rigpa years ago and were relieved to finally be able to talk about their experiences with others. Some had never spoken about their treatment for over 20 years, and having a space to do so was a great relief for them. They said how lonely they'd felt leaving without such support. A similar private Facebook group exists for those that experience abuse within the Shambhala organization. One of its moderators, Justin Ritsoniko, a former student who had worked in Sakyong Mipam's household for a number of years, similarly described the Facebook group to us as a key support for survivors, reducing isolation and providing community. Members of these Facebook groups function as what Willa Blythe Baker refers to as a witness circle, albeit in digital form. Private Facebook groups do not, however, do the work of integrating survivors' perspectives into broader Buddhist discourses about power, authority, and abuse, nor do they provide institutional, legal, or financial support for survivors. Additionally, survivor groups can sometimes privilege one group of survivors over others, or some vectors of abuse over others. For instance, the public Shambhala Facebook group has not always been sensitive to racial dynamics and has prioritized sexual abuse over issues of racism within Shambhala. This reflects ongoing tensions between some white female survivors and their allies, and some practitioners of color in Shambhala, a complex and painful situation that we feel demonstrates the urgency for an intersectional approach to Buddhist sexual abuse. Since institutional responses to abuse have been inadequate, a number of individual teachers and allies have stepped up to advocate for survivors, directing them towards resources, interceding with boards of directors, and providing pro bono legal assistance. Several are themselves survivors. In her early 80s, Jan Chosen Bays, who's pictured here, had a secret 2-year affair with Taizan Metsumi Roshi, her married teacher at the Zen Center of Los Angeles. Since then, Bays, who is a child abuse expert and a co-founder of the Great Vow Zen Monastery, has been responding to abuse and misconduct cases through a number of different avenues. For instance, in the early 2000s, she worked with fellow Zen teachers, Grace Shearson and Alan Sanuki, to compile and share reports of Sazaki's abuse, one of the senior Zen teachers. More recently, Bays has worked with Lama Willa Blythe Baker to provide support for abused students of Lama Norla, a group that includes Baker herself. Baker, a qualified Lama in the Kagyu order of Tibetan Buddhism, has been a key survivor advocate. In her 2018 article, Breaking the Silence about Sexual Misconduct, Baker describes her own experience with the supposedly celibate Norla, who initiated a secret sexual relationship shortly after he had ordained her as a nun. Baker eventually confronted the board of Kagyu Tupten Chuling, KTC, monastery, upon discovering that Norla's abuse had continued with other women after she left the community. In an interview with us, Baker described how she wrote an impact statement of her experience and formed a witness circle to support her in confronting the leadership at KTC. Following her own disclosure, she formed a support network with other female survivors of Norla. She developed questionnaires to gather and collate anonymous data about their experience, which she presented to the community. And you can only imagine how much incredible courage it takes for someone to do that work, right, without a lot of support. In the past several years, Baker, Bays, and Shearson have joined forces with Carol Murchison, a retired lawyer who specializes in corporate sexual harassment cases, to form a loose coalition for survivor advocacy. Murchison, who worked with Andrea Wynn to compile a report on abuse in Shambhala for BPS, Buddhist Project Sunshine, has conducted multiple investigations into abuse in Buddhist and yoga organizations and is currently involved in several lawsuits against Buddhist teachers. Bays, Shearson, Baker, and Murchison believe that Buddhist organizations are long overdue for implementing basic policies and procedures to prevent abuse and respond to it when it occurs. Murchison observes that despite their mission of spiritual progress and care for sentient beings, Buddhist organizations have much to learn from their profit-driven corporate world about how to respond to abuse allegations. The policies and procedures recommended by Murchison and colleagues are all designed to protect the survivor and respond honestly and effectively to their allegations. The basic and essential elements of a just and honest response to abuse allegations, according to Murchison and her colleagues, are easily swamped by communities and boards' desires to protect their teachers, institutions, and bank accounts. They include having a definition of abuse, a process for reporting abuse, and a regular procedure for responding to abuse. That's number one. Number two, enforcing said policy on abuse by investigating every allegation. Number three, refraining from action beyond, of course, suspending the duties of the accused until the investigation is completed. Number four, taking appropriate action once the investigation is completed so as to provide accountability. And number five, undertaking reparative steps, including an apology that acknowledges the harm done, maps out appropriate steps going forward, and honors the whistleblowers. This survivor-centered team has described their work as mainly preliminary to investigation. They've often played the role of intermediary with boards that tend to stonewall when allegations emerge. In their words, their work is for opening up the space for a full investigation to take place. In addition, they have carried out the essential work of listening to and believing survivors. Baker began her remarks at a recent online panel, this is the flyer for it, entitled Speaking As with and for Survivors, by looking straight into the Zoom camera and directly addressing survivors attending the event. I want to welcome you and let you know that you are not alone, she said. I support you and I see you. The group has established a confident, anonymous survivor mailbox and has publicly invited any survivors and allies to contact them and share their stories so that they can see what can be done. They are also seeking grant funding to create more institutional stability for the work they are already doing. Amid their goals is to create a survivor fund to pay for therapy, something very much needed. Another grassroots survivor-centered effort is the Heartwood Connecting Survivors of Guru and Teacher Abuse Project, which began in October 2021. And this is just a screenshot of the Heartwood Center's website. The two founders of the group, Rachel Montgomery and Nancy Floy, met through Carol Murchison. They've formed a strong bond. As Floy explains, we support each other on our paths of healing and activism and have become friends. Just knowing that Rachel is out there surviving and thriving despite her horrific guru abuse has been a lifetime for me and an inspiration, a lifeline for me and an inspiration. Montgomery is a survivor of sexual violence. She was raped by her Tibetan teacher in the shrine room of the community where she worked and practiced during her early 20s. When she finally named her abuse, the community, including close friends, turned against her. Floy was one of the 8 women who brought sexual abuse charges against Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche. Her case was recognized as a case of clergy abuse in the third-party investigation. She is also the founder and director of Heartwood, a community that she describes as being subject to financial and other abuses of power from female Tibetan Buddhist teacher Khandra Rinpoche. So Nancy Floy is a 2-time abuse survivor, sexual abuse, but also financial abuse by Khandra Rinpoche. Since breaking with Khandra Rinpoche in 2021, Floy and her community made a conscious decision to revision the center as a place of support and healing for survivors. One service they offer is free holistic healthcare to survivors who cannot afford to pay for healing modalities. Another key service is the Heartwood Connecting Survivors of Guru and Teacher Abuse group. The stated intention of the group reads, our shared hope is to prevent survivors from feeling shame, stigma, and loneliness. Guru and teacher abuse does not discriminate. All practitioners are at some risk for experiencing misuse or abuse of power. At Heartwood, we believe that survivors of guru and teacher abuse deserve a healthy and safe environment to process their experience through the healing potential of human relationships. Survivors and allies work together to find a foundation for well-being and become equipped to cope with the short-term and long-term challenges of surviving abuse. This monthly virtual group is peer-led and closed to the public. New members must be referred. The current group includes 9 survivors, 8 women, 1 man, all are white. Group members have experienced abuse in Insight, Zen, and Vajra communities, so across all the convert lineages. We were invited, Anne and I were invited along with Carol Murchison to the February and April meetings of the group as allies. And we've been struck by the intentionality and care that they've taken to create a safe container for survivors. So one example is their community guidelines, their community principles, guiding principles that were created and agreed upon by its members. Montgomery and Floyd gave us permission to share them with you, so I'm not going to read them out to you, but I'm going to say a couple things about them. The skillfulness with which Montgomery, Floyd, and other group members hold this survivor-friendly container contrasts dramatically with the response that most survivors have reported receiving in their Buddhist communities. Each element of the listed guidelines is an intervention against the unskillful community responses that are far more typical. Whereas Heartwood prioritizes safety, most survivors feel at risk emotionally, financially, and physically in their communities. While Heartwood holds a space of no teaching and no telling, most survivors are subjected to doctrinally based correctives to their experiences or subjected to spiritual bypassing. While Heartwood seeks to help survivors find their voices, most communities ignore, deflect, contradict, or silence survivor voices. While at Heartwood, dysregulation is met with understanding, most survivors are tone policed and criticized for expressing the emotional pain they experience, so forth. In addition to Heartwood's support work and free healing services, its founders also hope to create sustainable institutionalized change. This is a goal they share with the other group that we mentioned with Jan Chosen-Bay's Willow Blythe Baker and Murchison and Grace Shearson. Montgomery, whose background is in public health, is exploring the feasibility of an online prevention tool that could support survivors to document their abuse privately and detect repeat offenders in the Buddhist community, similar to those that exist for college campuses. And this is our conclusion. So who was centered in response to abuse? Our original focus when undertaking this project was to understand community responses to abuse in the age of Me Too, and think about how they would inevitably lead to emergent forms of Buddhism in America and a new Buddhist sexual ethics. Following this track, we have found evidence of new community models that that center transparency, accountability, and collectivity. However, we have also come to understand that Buddhist institutions typically respond to abuse in a manner that protects rather than transforms the community, its traditions, and its teachers. Despite Buddhist rhetorics of compassion and non-harm, it is sadly common for Buddhist institutions to ignore or hide abuse, and for Buddhist communities to silence shame or simply turn their backs on survivors of abuse that speak out. It's very difficult to get a clear sense of how power actually operates in Buddhist organizations, from looking at ethics statements, grievance policies, websites, chants, sacred texts, or public apologies, which are often performative. The best way to get a clear view of the dynamics of power that enable abuse in Buddhist communities is to speak to survivors and their advocates. For similar reasons, that is the institutional tilt towards preserving the community and protecting the teacher, many of the efforts to address abuse that we have described, that we described today in the presentation, have come from the margins of or outside of Buddhist institutions. Many are the efforts of coalitions of Buddhist teachers and practitioners working across lineages and communities. In fact, for a textual scholar of the classical tradition, which is my training, none of this should really come as a surprise. Once one poses the question of abuse to the text, to the classical tradition, the textual tradition, which are, authoritative texts for Buddhists, it turns out that the sexual ethics that govern past forms of Buddhist communal life appeared to have been, in fact, not very survivor-centered. There are many stories, for instance, of sexual violence in the Vinaya, which is the ancient legal code that guides monastic life even today. The Vinaya includes many cases of what we might term sexual abuse. cases where those in a position of religious authority violate the sexual boundaries of those with a lower religious status. And I've given you a bunch of examples on the slide. I'm not going to read them out, but these are all examples that appear in the Vinaya. There are a few mechanisms within Vinaya law to acknowledge the vulnerability of abuse victims and tilt some power in their direction. So for instance, Bhante Sujato, who is a progressive Australian monk in the Theravada tradition, recently published an essay titled, in Lion's Roar online magazine, titled, "The Buddha Would Have Believed You," in which he highlighted and explained the survivor center implications of 2 rules that allow trustworthy laywomen to witness against monks in cases of sexual violence. And that is a really big deal. Right? I also have kind of looked in the Vinaya for resources. My 2021 article on the notion of consent in the Vinaya, which was published online in Tricycle, also attempts to locate helpful ethical concepts in classical Buddhism. And I argue that while teachings attributed to the Buddha do not include a requirement of enthusiastic, affirmative verbal consent as protection against unethical sex, we do find there an interesting idea of sexual consent that may fit well with many situations of abuse in which verbal consent is coerced. Specifically, I point out a sexual ethics located in the Vinaya that emphasizes that real consent is a dynamic, subjective, internal state, not a verbal gesture indicating willingness. For the most part, however, the primary aim of Vinaya texts on sexual ethics is to articulate what constitutes a breach of sexual purity, in particular, a breach serious enough to result in permanent expulsion or temporary separation from the community. In other words, sexual ethics in monastic context is overwhelmingly focused on the purity of the monastic and of the community, and not on harm done to vulnerable individuals inside and outside of the community through sexuality. That's not the focus. Similarly, in early articulations of lay sexual ethics, especially the 3rd lay precept, which is the kind of short version is on the slide for you, and this precept advises against improper behavior in matters of desire. There is actually a focus when that precept is kind of elaborated in the tradition, the focus is on protecting the sexual rights of fathers and husbands, and those actually that patronize sex workers, not on committing harm to vulnerable people with sexual behaviors. In later Indian and Tibetan articulations of lay sexual ethics in Buddhism, there is an increased emphasis on whether the sex act itself is ethically improper in terms of timing, location, orifice, and partner. Hurting the vulnerable with sex or protecting those with less structural power through sex, protecting those with less structural power, again, is not the main focus. And if you are interested in learning more about this part of the tradition, Jose Cabazon's book is sort of the place to go. And that's, you see the reference on the slide there. Okay. I'm lost. Give me 1 second, sorry. I promise I have more to say. So sorry. That was real smooth. Thank you, Anne. Okay, so one other place in the tradition that's interesting to look at. Do I have this on? Right? Hear me? Is monastic procedural law, which is sort of how you adjudicate conflict in monastic communities. It's very detailed and elaborate, and at least partially consensus-based, and it might provide food for thought for Buddhist boards, right? Boards and leaders trying to navigate these situations, trying to navigate between the goals of accountability and transparency on the one hand and community preservation and harmony on the other. When push comes to shove, however, Monastic law prioritizes community harmony and the public reputation of the monastic community over adjudicating personal harm. Vinaya procedures that sweep under the rug, or in Vinaya parlance, cover over with grass, and this is actually a technical term in Vinaya law, cover over with grass, issues and conflicts that threaten to create schism. These procedures are eerily similar to the institutional priorities in contemporary Buddhist communities that have had the effect of minimizing or erasing supervisors' experiences and complaints. It is possible that Buddhist ethics and Buddhist authority structures could support transparency, accountability, and the centering of survivors, as Bhante Sujato suggests. However, both our ethnographic and our textual research has shown us that this hasn't been the norm historically or in the contemporary Buddhist world. Again and again, Buddhist organizations and the teachers that lead them move to protect themselves, their revenue streams, and the reputation of their lineages at the expense of survivors and sexual safety in general. Our research has indicated that many efforts to seriously address abuse have come from the grassroots, not from positions of institutional power. Many of the individuals and groups doing this work draw on their professional training as psychologists, doctors, lawyers, and journalists, not primarily on their Buddhist training, though they may also seek to align their efforts and approaches with Buddhist principles. Notably, many of these grassroots advocates and people working on this issue are themselves survivors. Thank you. So I think we have time for some questions. Right? We'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are and what your questions are. We're going to trade this back and forth.
My question is, how can maybe like from what you guys have learned from your research and your findings, like how can like a place like Denison like work on like sexual assault and how to deal with it and stuff like that?
Okay, so it's a bit awkward because we're sharing this mic.
We share everything.
So first of all, what was your name? Evan. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for the question. It's a really encouraging question, right? What can we do in our context? So actually, recently there was a very interesting symposium at Oxford University, and it was called Our Silence Will Not Protect Us. And it was a symposium on sexual violence in higher education that was also actually survivor-led from some female students in the UK. And they have developed a really great website with some really excellent resources. And so I'd be happy to share with Dr. Liang, and maybe she could pass it on. So I think that there are resources out there that, you know, rather than kind of starting from scratch, it's really helpful to look at what's already in operation. So I think that would be a great start for your context. So thank you so much.
Can I just talk in like that'll work, right? Okay. Well, I'm just thinking that, I know I also teach at a liberal arts college, and I know the kinds of conversations my students are having about these issues. And, I think sort of, we really emphasize doing survivor-centered research, which means a lot of things, but one of the things it definitely means is centering the experience that survivors have. So it's an ethical intervention, it's an ethical kind of position, methodology, but it's also, I would say like an epistemological intervention in the sense that the story is often told from lots of perspectives, not from the perspective who's experiencing the abuse and the harm, right? And so, I think that one of the things is just talking more in safe contexts. And I don't really know what that looks like here at Denison, but, having students talking to each other across groups, across demographic groups, across, men talking to women, talking to LGBTQI people, talking to people, all people of color and everyone across groups. But it has to be made a safe space, which, there's some work that needs to go into doing that. But, just kind of having the experiences spoken out into the space in a way that more people are hearing them, I think would be really helpful. Yeah. Well, right. What is,
How do you understand consent?
There are some nuances.
Yeah. I taught a class, I'm teaching actually still the class, there's a couple of weeks left, on sex and the sacred. And we had a module on sexual violence in Buddhism. And I had like the most interesting and generative conversations with my students who were all, similar age and probably background to the students here. And, just ask them like, well, what's consent? How would you define consent? And how did you learn about consent? And it was just a really rich conversation to learn and from the students. And I was like, do you feel like UCF is safe? Like, what's your sense of the sexual culture here? And so transparency and talking about things is a really good first step. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Can you hear me through the microphone? Okay. I think my question is for Dr. Langenberg in particular, because it pertains to something you said kind of in passing. I think you said something like a lot of the survivors that you both have spoken with were maybe emotionally, financially, and there might have been another word, vulnerable to the institution that they were affiliated with. Could you say something?
Legally, maybe, I don't know.
Legally?
Yeah.
I was wondering specifically about the financial vulnerability. Like, okay, can I do the thing where I have two questions and they're in relationship to each other? The other one is, so that's one interest. And then it seems related to me to like, what is different about American Buddhist convert communities versus, example, the Catholic Church, which has been roiled by its own sexual abuse scandal. Mm-hmm. Like financially, those are probably different things to be involved in. And I mean, there's many differences too. So I'm interested in some comparison like that in addition to the financial question. Okay.
So I'm going to start by saying this is definitely a question for both of us. So one of the things that sort of needs a little bit of explaining is that because we're doing this collaboratively, we don't both write every word. That's not really possible, but it is sort of a shared document and the research is shared. And so it wasn't like what Anne read is her research and what I read is my research. So I just wanted to clarify that just because it's really key. It's kind of central to what we're doing. So, but as far as the financial stuff, I'll answer that part and you can answer the other part. No, you go. No, you go. I'm sorry. So as far as the financial vulnerability, that's such a big part of the story because a lot of people who are who experience abuse in Buddhist communities, it's so often the case that they're actually living in the community. They've committed pieces of their life to the community. So, for instance, we've had several people, we've talked to who've gone into these communities straight out of college. They didn't have a bank account. They didn't have a career. They didn't go to graduate school. They don't have anything to fall back on. And so when they are in the situation, feel they have to leave the community, they're leaving to like real precarity, right? And also a lot of times they're doing like pro bono work. They're doing free work. They're working for free. They're working for room and board or a very small stipend. So they're not, it's incredibly precarious. And that could be a reason to stay in a community that didn't feel very healthy to you, right? So that's one thing. And, also, I was going to, you have things to say. Yeah.
Sorry. I just did want to point out it's kind of just what you said, but more specifically, 3 women that we interviewed who are survivors had, were just to give a sense of the college students here, had been going to the center or the monastery as college students and then made that full-time transition. So it is giving up their spiritual community, their most important relationship still with the teacher, their job and everything. And then there's one woman that we're working with now who's actually in her perhaps 50s or 60s. She's quite old, but she's been living as a retreat manager. And has had this for several years, 10 years maybe, and she's now in this situation with the teacher who was suspended for sexually harassing her and was suspended for say 6 months, but is now coming back to the center. And she's like, well, I live here, it's my home, I can't even not go to meditation to see him. So it is really such an issue. And then with the Catholic comparison, I'm a bit cautious to make any comparisons. I don't know if we've got that much data, but mostly especially the children who were abused were not, they were not living at the center, but they were part of the wider parish. So there is actually a distinct feature of Western convert communities of the retreat center or the monastery. So I think that's a distinction with the Catholic centers. We
also
haven't
financial wherewithal in general, the money to hire to hire lawyers, the money to go to therapy. Like, so one Noah Levine, whose face was on one of the slides, the woman who brought a case against him for rape, she ended up leaving. This was in LA. She ended up leaving because she felt so at risk that she ended up leaving LA and going to San Francisco, which was like a huge financial disruption for her. Some of the students have already heard this in Dr. Leong's class. Sorry for the repeat story, but so that was a huge. I mean, you know what it's like to move. It's very expensive, and also losing her apartment, losing switching jobs. Like she had a lot of financial vulnerability anyway. So in the meantime, Noah's got all kinds of resources and has actually a lawyer who is a student who's working pro bono for him, right? So I'm not going to make the comparison to the Catholic Church, but I think in some of these situations, you do have this kind of much more powerful person with a lot of resources behind them. And then the survivor is just like in a very different position in terms of their ability to, get help, the kind of help they need. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the case of Noah Levine, his student/lawyer threatened so many people with libel that in fact so many people, not his alleged victims, but community members, board members, other teachers who they were really, really scared that they were going to get sued. And I interviewed a board member, and she herself was a lawyer. And she said, like, nearly all of the board resigned because they were worried of the threat. And she was, I think, one of two who stayed. And she said, even though she knew that he didn't have a case against them, the way that the law works, she knew it would also be an incredibly drawn out process and would actually end up costing her a lot of money. And that's as a lawyer herself. And she ended up staying because she felt she just had to and everyone else left. But it really shows what we were trying to describe, the tilt of power towards the teacher. And so that's why when often Buddhists respond with a Buddhist doctrine of, well, we have to treat everyone equally, we have to have equanimity. But that equanimity assumes that there's an equal power relationship. It doesn't account for the vast disparity. So if you approach a power differential with equanimity, often all it does is maintain the power differential, right? So that's why I know that you know this because you're a Buddhist philosopher yourself, but that's why we're really saying the need to center survivors is also to disrupt the already huge, centering of the teacher, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of you have read the Indian philosopher Shantideva, but that kind of argument about seeing your enemy as your teacher, right, and kind of as an opportunity to exercise compassion and like really develop that virtue, that kind of language gets brought into these situations, like and people really embody it in a kind of day-to-day vernacular way. They're like, well, But I also feel really bad for him because, X, Y, and Z. But it, as Anne said, it does really, what it does is it kind of allows the power structure that already exists to just keep, perpetuating itself. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I'm thinking, Anne, your comment, common practice, standard practice number 101 for any nonprofit is to have liability insurance for every board member, which clearly this organization needs to learn. But leaving that aside, I've kind of a different open-ended question, and for the students here, excuse me, I'll sort of give about 60 seconds of background to my question so you know where I'm coming from. I'm thinking of the work of Kiran Narayan, the anthropologist. In her very first book in 1989 is talking about Hindu gurus and sort of relationships with them of both Indians and American sort of converts, you might say. Now, and the reason I mention it's 89 is it's before sort of all sorts of things blew up in the Catholic Church and American Protestant organizations. I mean, they were there, but the publicity wasn't there. And also certainly before, for the most part, a lot of the publicity about Buddhist teachers in the convert communities here in the US. I mean, there were sort of rumblings, but it wasn't the issue that you're able to research now. And she comments that a problem that a lot of the Anglo disciples of her guru ran into was a lack of an adequate cultural understanding of what it means actually to be a guru and to be a disciple in an Indian context. And she's not using that as a way of victim blaming. She's just saying there's some profound cultural misunderstandings that, she found many of the Anglo converts, it was sort of, oh, he's the guru, he's enlightened, whatever he says goes. Whereas in an Indian context, Indians are, there are all sorts of folklore maxims and things like that you never trust a guru. You have to test him out really strongly before you commit to him, precisely because you are going to commit and, you want to make sure what you're committing to in that way. So I have a two-part question. One is if you could sort of reflect a little bit on that cultural disparity, maybe that sort of the notion of the individual guru is not there in the Abrahamic traditions, or certainly the Christian and Jewish. It's an institutional teacher, but it's not an individual teacher in the same way. But also as it is transformed, especially in Buddhism, from Indian-born gurus to, in Buddhism, or Japanese, Tibetan gurus, to American teachers. To what extent is it perhaps even the case that a lot of the convert teachers have a very different understanding of what that role and relationship is that is further causing the problems? I mean, there's a question in there somewhere, but if you can sort of reflect on those a little bit as scholars of comparative religion, I think that would be useful.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that question. I'll just start by saying that that's something that some of our colleagues in Tibetan studies are really interested in working on, which is, Holly Gailey has worked on this and some other people about the kind of indigenous critiques in Tibet of guru devotion, of the position of lamas, the really kind of exalted position that they have, at least appear to have, but the ways that lay people pass around information about them, there are checks and balances, right, in lay society. There are things that even someone in a lama position, will do him harm if he does, right? That there are sort of channels of communication, and a kind of like grassroots skepticism, right? That probably are absent in the U.S. So, and I think that there is some value in understanding that more. So I would say that I also, I think your point is well taken. Like the guru culture that we have, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Anne because I'm actually a textual scholar and I don't know enough about contemporary America guru culture, but you do. But I think it's not really, it's a different thing. It's like bears a family resemblance, but it's a different dynamic as you're pointing out. Yeah.
I'll just add, I think that is true what Amy said, and I think that cultural fluency or even literacy always helps in any situation, right? The more knowledge you've got of how a traditional model operates in its, indigenous context is really helpful. Many of the first generation teachers and gurus that came over to the US operated in a more kind of singular fashion. So they had more autonomy than they would have in, their home context, where they would have had, again, more checks and balances. I think you've also got the great kind of idealism and naivete and Orientalism of the 1960s counterculture, which is still very much part of the convert scene. Less now. I think there's been a tempering of it, but there's still a lot of ideas of, the mysterious East, the whatnot. However, with all that said, I think it's also essential not to imagine abuse is only happening in Western contexts. As we really want to try and show that the abuse has occurred across Asian American and white American teachers. It's unfortunately a transnational phenomena. So I think that often what we've found is that,
but not just a modern phenomenon,
and not just a modern phenomena, because we have found that there is, in a way, it's like a response to defend the tradition, right? That it's like, oh, but it's just in the West that it's got this problem, and that's tremendously naive. And we know from the tradition itself that the topic of abusive gurus has been commented on, and and we also know, if you think about the Catholic context, that even though institutions can be checks and balances, they can also provide institutional cover-ups, enabling and complicity. So I'm actually in quite a negative state of mind with this research, because it is very disheartening to see. I mean, the Kamapa is now facing, charges of abuse. I mean, it's really, it's not rogue lamas. It's easier to dismiss when it's like a rogue lama. Like, what does Noah Levine really know about Buddhism, right? But it's across the scale. So I think we've always got to get the both ends right.
Yeah.
So it's more important, we think, to ask the question of what is distinct about the abuse in these specific contexts, rather than this only happens in these contexts. So. Thank you, John.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I just was looking again at Shoes Outside the Door, which is a journalist, nonfiction writer, wrote an account of Richard Baker, right, and the Zen Center, San Francisco Zen Center, and that whole kind of scandal. But one of the things that I read when I was looking at it on the plane is that the Dalai Lama actually invited Richard Baker to come and hang out at his residence after Richard Baker got kicked out of the Zen Center for abuse of power. And so, I don't know.
Disheartening, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, and I don't mean to be reductive, but I will say that one of the things that I keep thinking about with this research is that, to me, the kind of through line are these like basic structures of patriarchy, which enable a certain kind of instrumentalization of women's sexuality and, consistently place men in positions of power where not all, they're not necessarily going to do it, but they have the opportunity to abuse that. And it happens consistently. So, yeah.
One thing that I also want to add that I think
people think it's kind of okay. That's the other piece. They look away. It's it's just the way things are.
Well, I also think that one of the things that's so fascinating with this research is when we're always trying to think, why are people ignoring this? If you think about it, especially with, say, the Tibetan tradition, with the, very, specific doctrines of, the with doctrines like pure perception, or seeing, the teacher as a kind of living, kind of guru, like Buddha, sorry. Sexual abuse is it's a challenge to the whole worldview. Do you know what I mean? Because if the Buddha, if the teacher who's considered a living Buddha is found guilty of sexual abuse, that's such a challenge to the whole, it's right at the center of the doctrine. So there's a lot at stake, if you think about it, to minimizing turning away from these cases. Because what does it mean? I mean,
and,
it's
religion scholars that we are know that what's going to crack, not the worldview, not the incredibly powerful, persuasive religious worldview. That's not the thing that's going to give. The thing that's going to give is she's making it up. She's crazy. It didn't really happen that way. When except that's what's going to, yeah.
Not to put you off Buddhism, I actually practice Buddhism. I just feel like important to add.
Yeah,
Myself.
very word from England.
How are we doing for time?
Everyone's more than welcome to stay up with the questions, but I want to be aware of people's time and
Yeah.
want to invite everyone to join the influence today.